Solomon. First, thank you very much for taking time off your very busy schedule assisting the victims of recent natural disasters. And I think it's a context that, again, points to the importance of the issues of resilience and livelihood security that SSE is really all about. Dean Gonzalez, thank you very much for the invitation and the venue. Representatives of ALF, ASLI, and ASEC, thank you very much for the invitation, fellow panelists, delegates. I also want to thank Secretary Solomon for having brought the grassroots perspective, because what I'm going to do is talk very broadly, in very general terms, about what's wrong with the world, in general terms, what is SSE, what sort of policy environment can enable SSE, and finally I'll mention some of the challenges that confronts the agenda of promoting SSE. In the United Nations now, as you know, the Secretary General and various high-level panels and the General Assembly are taking a lead in the whole question of rethinking development. In the context after the multiple crises of finance, food and fuel, and in the thinking that's going on about how to move beyond the Millennium Development Goals, there's a growing consensus initiated by civil society, certain strands of academia, but now the world's governments and some of the elites, that we need to rethink development. So if we stand back and sort of think what are the crucial challenges that the world faces in the area of development, the sorts of things we're concerned about at UNRISD, the UN Research Institute for Social Development, and other UN agencies, are the issues of the growing inequalities of income, wealth, gender, and to do with location or regional disparities, the environmental costs of industrialization, of high-input agriculture, consumption patterns, obviously all linked to the problems of climate change, the multiple crises of recent years, but also recurring crises. It seems every decade or so we get a major sort of financial crisis, as was experienced in the late 90s in Asia, and more current and more recently with the global financial crisis. And the problem of informal economy, underemployment, indecent work, all these problems have been escalating, and it seems that the current approaches and the current models we have aren't sufficient to deal with these issues. Just on the issue of what the ILO calls vulnerable employment, which is basically own account workers, self-employed workers, or the self-employed who don't employ anyone else, plus their family members. Regarding the unemployed, the ILO calculates that there are about 200 million people unemployed, and that this figure is rising. It's not expected to decline before 2017. They also find that the regions that have halted the decline in unemployment have experienced a decline in job quality. What they term vulnerable employment, they estimate there to be about 1.5 million workers affected by vulnerable, or who fall into this category of vulnerable employment. As regards informal employment, the figures are for South Asia, that people in the informal economy account for about 82% of non-farm employment. In Sub-Saharan Africa and East Asia, it's around 66%, and in Latin America, about 50%. What they also find is that in regions that experience high growth, that you do not get a significant reduction in informal employment. Next, please. If we think back to, in the literature on development, what's often held up as the classic models about what worked, we're told about the welfare states, particularly in Europe. We're told about the developmental states, particularly in East Asia, and in the mid-20th century, the idea of the decent work enterprise, i.e. the corporations that to some extent were concerned about the conditions of labor, minimum wages, occupational health and safety, in addition to just worrying about profits. Now, these models were, in their time, conducive to relatively high growth, full employment of men, not women, and there was a formal sector that showed a remarkable capacity to absorb surplus labor from other sectors. So when you had development transitions from agriculture to industrialization, you had a formal sector that could absorb that surplus labor from agriculture. You also had significant sort of social protections, welfare regimes in place, and a degree of provision of social security through the workplace. But these models also had major limitations. Obviously, the environmental consequences. No one cared much about the environment, and we're suffering the consequences now of climate change. And in relation to gender inequality, the problems, the fact that in those decades, it was essentially seen that the women's role was basically taking care of the elderly, the household, youth, etc. What we also see is the unraveling of this model with globalization, and particularly with neoliberal policies. Next, please. If we were to stand back and sort of characterize in simple terms how contemporary policy, development policy, is attempting to address these problems, then we tend to have macroeconomic and fiscal policies that tend to favor investors, traders, the private sector. We have still efforts to promote high growth, but employment is seen as sort of a secondary. It will hopefully trickle down from high growth. Employment is not at the center of macroeconomic policy. We have new growth poles identified, particularly areas like green economy, but it's an approach that tends to be it's sort of a market-centered approach to green economy. Considerable attention to active labor market policies and training, skills development, SME development and entrepreneurship, the economic empowerment of women and small producers, integrating small producers into global value chains, the movement around corporate social responsibility, trying to get big global corporations to improve their environmental and social performance through new standards and voluntary initiatives, and the emphasis on social protection and safety nets when it comes to social policy. Next, please. So what's missing? I think largely what's missing is SSE, Social and Solidarity Economy. So the field of SSE is, what we're talking about is the following types of organizations and enterprises. Clearly, cooperatives are a large part of the SSE. The rise, what we're seeing, of social enterprise and community enterprise. NGOs transitioning from depending just on grants to having to generate more sustainable streams of income, so they're sort of transitioning also to becoming social enterprises. We have the fair trade groups and the fair trade networks. We have the organization of the informal economy workers, of street vendors, of domestic workers, etc. And represented by the slides on the bottom right, very numerous forms of alternative finance that are coming up, whether it be barter schemes or community currency schemes, etc. So, next please. So, in defining SSE, I think there are four key aspects. So we're talking about the production of goods and services by organizations and enterprises that have explicit social and often environmental objectives, from its basic needs provisioning, providing care services, employing the unemployed, the disabled, food security. They also have cooperative and associative relations of different sorts among members and the community. Aspects to do with self-management, often democratic self-management, and new values of sharing, solidarity, and what the indigenous concept in Latin America of buen vivir, which is living in harmony with people, living in harmony with the planet, with Mother Earth. So there's some of the core sort of features and principles. Next, please. SSE is an expanding economy, particularly after crises, finance, food, etc. The International Cooperative Alliance talks about 1 billion cooperative members worldwide. The ILO, in their recent analysis of what's happening with cooperatives, notes particularly the revival of cooperatives in Africa and Latin America. We see, as we've heard already, the rise of social enterprise, particularly in regions like Europe and Asia. In India alone, 2.5 million self-help groups, mainly women's self-help groups, with about 30 to 40 million women integrated in those self-help groups. Also in South Asia, millions of people engaged in community forestry initiatives where they come together collectively to protect the commons, another key role for SSE. The growth of fair trade markets last year, I think in 2012, certified fair trade products amounted to $6 billion. And the phenomenon of what we can call big co-op. So organizations like Mondragon in Spain, Amul in India, Desjardins in Quebec, these are amongst the largest companies in these countries.